So let's talk about crowd control weapons. You've probably heard the official term for them, less lethal. It's a phrase that sounds pretty reassuring, right? It suggests a safer, more humane way to handle things compared to deadly force. But what if that term isn't just a little inaccurate? What if it's dangerously misleading? Let's get into what's really going on behind that name.
I want you to picture the scene in Portland, Oregon on June 2nd, 2020. Media reports described a city that felt like it was under a chemical siege. Police unleashed what one report called a tear-gassing fury. And this wasn't about targeting a few specific people. Nope. This was about saturating entire city blocks. And that, it raises a really big question.
If these weapons can literally create walls of gas that trap whole crowds of people, how can we really be sure they're safe? What is the actual human cost and the environmental cost of deploying them like this on our city streets? Well, that's exactly what we're going to break down right now. Okay, first things first, we have to talk about the name itself. The term less lethal, well, it's not some neutral scientific classification. It's a strategic choice. You could almost call it a branding exercise, a tool that's used to downplay how severe these weapons are and, frankly, to make it easier to justify using them. And here's where we see this huge disconnect between the official language and the reality on the ground. On the one hand, the framing suggests, temporary discomfort, stuff that goes away. But then you look at the work of groups like Physicians for Human Rights, and they've documented a horrifying list of serious injuries, permanent disabilities, and even deaths from these weapons. So what exactly is in this so-called less lethal arsenal? Well, the big one you've probably heard of is CS gas, what most of us just call tear gas. Then you've got OC, or pepper spray, which is a seriously powerful inflammatory agent. But there's another one, HC smoke, which is often just used to create confusion and cover, and as we're about to see, it is anything but harmless. And this brings us to one of the most unbelievable, just plain shocking contradictions in all of international law. Get this, the rules for using these chemicals in a war are actually stricter than the rules for using them on a country's own citizens. Okay, so there's this major international treaty, the Chemical Weapons Convention, and it states point blank that riot control agents, things like tear gas, are prohibited from being used as a method of warfare. Why? Because they're considered too indiscriminate, too cruel to use against enemy soldiers on a battlefield. But, and this is a huge but, that very same treaty has a critical loophole. It specifically allows a country to use these exact same chemical weapons for domestic law enforcement, which includes riot control. So you end up with this totally bizarre legal paradox. A weapon that is too inhumane for war is somehow perfectly acceptable to use against your own civilian population. To really understand what this paradox looks like in the real world, we have to go back to Portland in the summer of 2020. The city basically became a living laboratory, giving us a staggering amount of data on what happens when these chemical agents are used on a scale we've just never seen before. On one night, which locals started calling Tear Gas Tuesday, police deployed at least 148 munitions. Let that sink in. 148 rounds in just 3 hours. The vast majority of them were chemical weapons. We're talking about a completely relentless barrage. And that barrage ended up saturating an 18-block area of downtown Portland. This was not about dispersing a few people from a specific spot. This was about creating a massive, persistent public health hazard that put anyone and everyone in the area at risk. Now, how do we actually measure that kind of danger? Well, the U.S. Occupational Safety and Health Administration, that's OSHA, they have a very clear safety limit for CS gas. Anything over 2 milligrams per cubic meter is officially considered immediately dangerous to life or health. So remember that number, 2 milligrams per cubic meter. And this is where the data just becomes jaw-dropping. A groundbreaking analysis found that on a typical street corner in Portland that night, the CS gas concentration peaked at over 220 times that immediately dangerous safety limit. And at its highest recorded point, it was over 2,200 times the level considered immediately dangerous to human life. It's just off the charts. As you can imagine, the impact of that kind of extreme chemical exposure didn't just fade away when the smoke cleared. It left a lasting scar, not just on people's health, but on the entire city's environment. The harm also showed up in ways that were systemic and, frankly, shocking. One peer-reviewed study found an incredible link between tear gas exposure and reproductive health. More than half of the menstruating people they surveyed reported major abnormalities, things like intense cramping and unusual bleeding.
This suggests these chemicals aren't just irritants. They might actually be acting as endocrine-disrupting toxins in the body. And it wasn't just the people. The city itself was poisoned. All that chemical residue settled on streets, on buildings, everywhere. Eventually, it got washed away, flowing directly into storm drains, carrying toxins like cyanide and perchlorate with it. And its final destination? The Willamette River, a vital local waterway, now contaminated by this chemical assault.
You see, the danger doesn't even stop with the main chemical that's listed on the canister. Because the way these things are deployed, the intense heat from the pyrotechnics inside, that process actually creates a whole new set of toxic byproducts that nobody is talking about.
So the real question becomes, what are people actually breathing in when they're caught in this toxic stew? Because it is so much more complex and so much more dangerous than just a simple irritant.
Okay, check this out. When CS gas is deployed from a hot-burning canister, the heat actually breaks it down and creates new compounds. One of the nastiest is hydrogen chloride. Now, the second this gas hits the moisture in your eyes, your throat, or your lungs, it instantly forms hydrochloric acid. Yeah, a strong, corrosive acid. So people aren't just being exposed to an irritant, they're literally being forced to inhale acid.
And what about those smoke grenades we mentioned, the ones used for cover? Well, the common HC smoke grenade isn't just some benign screening tool. It's really a chemical weapon in its own right. A 1997 report prepared for the Department of Defense concluded HC smoke was highly toxic, carcinogenic, and potentially lethal. It unleashes a cocktail of chemicals that includes zinc chloride and even known human carcinogens.
So when you start putting all of this evidence together, the misleading name, the battlefield paradox, the extreme toxicity, and all these hidden chemical byproducts, it forces you to completely reassess what these weapons really are and what they're being used for.
When you look at the whole picture, the case against them is clear. They're indiscriminate, spreading uncontrollably and creating citywide health hazards. They're medically harmful, causing severe, lasting, and systemic damage. They're chemically complex, creating a toxic stew of unstudied and dangerous byproducts. And, let's face it, they're politically repressive, often used as a first-strike tool to punish and shut down dissent.
And all of this leaves us with one final, unavoidable question. The logic that bans these weapons in war but allows them in our own communities is it's deeply flawed. It creates a situation where civilians engaged in protest have fewer protections from chemical weapons than an enemy soldier in an armed conflict. It's a paradox that really challenges our basic principles of public health and even democratic freedom itself.